No. Started. Okay. Hi everyone. So today on the eve of Ambedkar Jayanti, we are very happy to organize the first talk of the SCST students cell of IIT Bombay. We have invited Professor Ajantha Subramanian, and she will be giving the talk on the title Meritocracy and Democracy: The Social Life of Caste in India. Now, I invite Meenakshi to give an intro of the of Professor Ajantha.
Thanks, Pranay, and hi everyone. I welcome you all on behalf of the IIT Bombay SCST cell. We all are here to listen to the talk by Professor Ajantha Subramanian on meritocracy and democracy, the social life of caste in India. It's a real privilege and a delight to be able to introduce to Professor Subramanian here today. Uh, Professor Ajantha Subramanian is a professor and department chair of the Department of Anthropology and South Asian Studies and Mehra Family Professor of South Asian Studies at Harvard University. Her research interests include political economy, political ecology, colonialism and post coloniality, space, citizenship, South Asia, and South Asian diaspora. Her first book, Shorelines Space and Rights in South India, published in 2009 by Stanford University, chronicles the struggles for resource rights by Catholic fishers on India's southwestern coast, with a focus on how they have used spatial imaginaries and practices to constitute themselves as political subjects. Her second book, The Caste of Merit Engineering Education in India, uh, about which and from which Professor Subramanian is going to talk today, was published by Harvard University Press in 2019. And the book tracks the relationship between meritocracy and democracy in India in order to understand the production of merit as a form of caste property and its implications for democratic transformation. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Subramanian today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Am I audible? You can hear me?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be inaugurating the series put on by the STSC cell at IIT Bombay. Um, I'm going to be speaking for most of the hour, and I hope that the presentation, I mean, it's a fairly complicated presentation, but I hope that the main points get across as clearly as possible. So what I'd like to do today is the following. I am going to first give you a sense of how caste worked within engineering education in the pre-independence period, because the longer history of engineering in India is very important for understanding contemporary dynamics. Second, I'll lay out how the relationship between caste and merit is framed within the constitutional language around reservations. Third, I'll discuss how this language gets taken up within the IITs to advance arguments about merit. And then finally, I'll end with some examples of anti reservation politics and how anti reservation politics has undergone changes over the years. So I know this is a lot, but please bear with me as I take you through the talk. So, in brief, what I'm hoping to show you is that merit has never been simply a measure of talent and hard work. Merit has always been a product of inherited privilege, and claims to merit have been claims to protect those forms of privilege. At the same time, the language of merit has been used to justify social inequality in the name of democratic equality. And this is because meritocracy is commonly thought of as an important democratic principle, right? And a democratic principle that marks a break a break with older forms of hierarchy and exclusion. So, because merit seems to refer to notions of individual worth and innate ability that have nothing to do with inherited privilege, the language of merit actually hides the very forms of social inequality in which it is grounded. And it's only when political challenges to these dominant conceptions of merit arise, such as in the demand for reservations, it's only then that we're able to see how the collective inheritances of caste actually lie behind these claims to merit. And this is why, so in my book, one of the key cases that I take up is the case of Tamil Nadu and IIT Madras. And the reason why the history of Tamil Nadu is so important for thinking about the relationship between caste and merit is because this is a region where challenges to upper caste entitlements, entitlements to education and to professional employment, these challenges arose very early, right? Which is why Tamil Nadu becomes an incredibly important precedent for understanding the politics of meritocracy in India more generally. Okay, so let me start with the dominant conception of merit. So usually, merit is understood as an intrinsic quality of a person that can be seen in individual achievement. It's also seen as something that can be measured, right? As an objective quality that can be measured. And the measurement of merit is most commonly done through forms of standardized assessment. So one instance of standardized assessment is the mass examination, like the JEE, where individual rank is understood as an objective measure of merit, right? We can also see how this works in the marketplace through the competition for jobs, where salary levels are similarly assumed to reflect individual merit. So these standardized measures, right, produce this conception of merit as a mark of individual ability, individual competitiveness, right? And because merit is assumed to be individual, because it's assumed to be innate, and because it's assumed to be objectively measurable, the benefits, right, that are enjoyed by the meritorious, these benefits are seen as justly deserved. But when we look at the history of engineering, of the engineering profession in India, we see a much more complicated picture in which the evaluation of individual intellectual ability and of technical skill has always been shaped by caste status. So to understand how merit has been defined and who is considered meritorious, we need to situate the meaning of merit within a broader context of social inequality, both past social inequality and present social inequality. So what I'm hoping to show you is that there are these continuities, right, in how caste exclusion and stratification has worked within engineering, both in the pre-independence period and today, right? There are continuities that we can see. At the same time, the post-independence discourse of merit has actually made it more difficult to see how caste continues to work, right, within higher education and within the professions in India. Okay, so let me now turn to the pre-independence period. So from the mid to the late 19th century, what we see most clearly in Indian engineering is not caste stratification, but racial stratification, right? And these efforts to preserve racial barriers to access. But demands to open up the technical sciences to Indians, right, did see results. And over the course of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, we see more Indians coming into engineering, right? We see them entering engineering education. We see them entering the colonial engineering services. And the Indianization of engineering followed some clear patterns. And most importantly, what we see is that caste becomes a really important basis for inclusion, right, into the profession. And there are many examples of how the British used caste to track Indians into different tiers of technical training. So, this is a quote from the military board in the 1850s. And this gives us a sense of the British expectations when it came to the social background of Indian engineers. So I'm just going to read the quote out. It says, a master workman must know his trade and know it well, but a civil engineer has a craft of his own. His skill is in his science. His tools are his formulae and his surveying and mathematical instruments. His labors are for the most part those of the mind. His studies those of projecting and controlling. And he must therefore be one of a very different class and status in society, as well as of totally different attainments from those of the mechanic whose labors he has to direct. So in this quote, we see the importance of social background, right, for determining who could be an engineer versus who could be a tradesman, a workman. We also see how social background was equated with particular kinds of knowledge and skill. So unlike the workman who labored with his hands, the engineer's labors were supposed to be those of the mind, right? So there's a distinction between the hands and the mind. And unlike the mechanic, whose knowledge was seen as mainly technical, the engineer was to be somebody who dealt with conceptual knowledge, especially the conceptual knowledge of science and mathematics. So these assumptions about who the engineer should be was also shared by upper castes. And the British found that upper castes would only enter technical fields if these fields were clearly distinguished from other forms of manual labor. So a member of the Indian Industrial Commission, which took place from 1916 to 1918, a member of the commission framed the problem in this way. He said, our trouble in India is that the practical side of industry is not at present considered an honorable calling by any but a fraction of the section of the Indian community who should be attracted to our large industries. And until there is more inclination on the part of the Indian student to take his coat off, the advantages of technical education are bound to be to a great extent nullified. So, of course, there were many lower caste Indians among whom practical skills were clearly visible. But these were not the people whom the British perceived as the right kind of Indian students, right? The right kind of Indian students who were suited for technical education. So why did upper castes, who historically were not skilled in technical trades, and who historically even disdained manual labor, why did they end up flocking to the engineering profession? In other words, how did, by the end of the colonial period, how was it that the engineering services ended up being monopolized by upper castes? How did this happen? So the first reason why upper castes went into engineering was a shift in the space of training. So engineering training happened in the classroom, right? It didn't happen in the in the guild, as was previously the case for artisanship and the trades. And this shift to the classroom as the space of training gave it a much higher status, right? As it made it into a form of professional labor, not just manual labor. And also the emphasis on mathematics and science as part of engineering education was particularly appealing, right, to upper castes who considered mathematics to be the most conceptually challenging discipline, and one in which they thought of themselves as naturally gifted. So this was one reason, right, the space of training to the classroom. This was one reason why engineering and technical education in general became more attractive to upper castes. A second reason was the social makeup of different technical training programs. So although Indian upper castes avoided the vocational schools and the industrial schools that were set up by the colonial government, because these were seen as lower caste spaces, they were willing to take up technical education once there were separate institutions, right, that were set up for engineering. And this comes through clearly in a statement by a man named S.F. Downing, who was the principal of the Sibpur College of Engineering. So Downing says, I have learned from um, conversation with respectable educated natives that the fact of the department belonging to the Presidency College gives it a certain status in the eyes of native society. Consequently, a superior class is attracted to it than would be the case were a school attached to large government shops in which the students would have to work daily, such manual labor being unfortunately considered derogatory by upper class Bengalis. So, in addition to rejecting manual labor, upper caste also rejected cohabiting and co-dining with lower castes. And these were major factors in how upper caste perceived the hierarchy of engineering colleges. And so we see this in the comparison between Sibpur and the College of Engineering at Roorkee. So unlike Roorkee, Sibpur provided 3 tiers of training, right? One for officers, one for supervisors, and one for carpenters, blacksmiths, and tinsmiths from these technical schools. And because of the large presence of lower castes, Sibpur couldn't attract upper castes, right, to the college. And communal dining was a particularly big problem. So at Roorkee, upper caste students ate by themselves and they also dressed formally for dinner, right? Whereas at Sibpur, the students had a joint mess, right, across these different tiers of training. Everyone, no matter if they were um, supervisors or officers or carpenters, they all ate together. And this practice of communal dining across caste divides made it impossible to recruit Indian upper caste to Sibpur. And most of them opted instead for Roorkee, where these caste practices of purity and pollution were observed, they were maintained, right? And so here we see how this kind of preoccupation with caste distinction really shaped which colleges upper caste were willing to go to, right, to receive technical training. A third reason for the upper caste attraction to engineering was its association with the colonial state. So, as engineers who worked for the Public Works Department or the Railways Department, upper caste derived a sense of pride and status from these highly desirable forms of colonial state employment. So the upper caste embrace of engineering had everything to do with the fact that engineering was a modern profession associated with conceptual knowledge and with the colonial state, and disassociated from artisanship and industrial labor, both of which were associated with lower castes. So in all of these examples, what we see is how important and how explicit caste distinctions were to the workings of engineering education. So it was only upper caste Indians with family histories of literacy and education who were able to enter the ranks of the engineering profession, and they only did so once engineering was clearly distinguished, right, from lower caste occupations. And we see, the membership roles. The membership roles of the Institute of Civil Engineers and the Institute of Mechanical Engineers in London, which were the main professional engineering bodies in the British Empire. We see from these membership roles that the Indian members were all upper caste, mostly Brahmin. And this was equally the case with the Institution of Engineers that was set up in Calcutta in 1920, which was the Indian counterpart to these professional bodies in London. And although some of the first presidents of the Institution of Engineers in Calcutta were Europeans, all the subsequent ones were Brahmin members, right, of the Department of Public Works or Railways, all of them from Madras or Bengal. And in contrast to this kind of preponderance of upper caste in engineering, those, when we look at technical training in handicrafts or who went to these industrial schools, we see that most of them were from lower caste groups, right? So I'm now going to turn to Madras Presidency to give you a sort of a clear sense of how lower castes were tracked into these other lower tiers of technical training, okay? So in Madras Presidency, lower caste groups were identified as non-Brahmin Hindus. Okay, this was the kind of terminology that was used to refer to lower castes. And this report, this quote comes from the report of the Director of Public Instruction, right, in 1905. And what this says is, so the quote is, out of the large population of this presidency, less than 3,000 children were receiving technical instruction in the various handicraft and industrial schools. And of these, less than 900 were non-Brahmin Hindus, the class of the community to which the bulk of hereditary workers in wood and metal and textile fabrics belong. So now this quote is interesting because it shows the colonial state's understanding of the relationship between caste and occupation, right? We've already seen how that worked when it came to upper caste. Now we're seeing how it worked when it came to lower caste. So one colonial official, his name was Alfred Chatterton, and he was appointed the superintendent of industrial education in Madras in 1910. And Chatterton really saw non-Brahmins as the groups who were best suited for industrial schools. So in this quote from him, he says, for the indigenous industries, it seems inevitable that we must have recourse to industrial schools. But I would suggest that instruction in each industry should be confined to the sons and relatives of those actually engaged in the industry at the present time. That is to say, we should carry on the industrial schools on a caste basis. So Chatterton's reason for this, his reason for organizing industrial schools along caste lines, and especially making sure that lower castes got priority when it came to these industrial schools, he saw this as a form of protection, right? He wanted to ensure that traditional artisans, right, lower castes who came from these traditional artisanal backgrounds, he wanted to make sure that they were given priority in these industrial schools. But what his efforts did was they actually strengthened the link between caste and particular forms of knowledge and skill. And as a result, in Madras, lower castes were tracked into these lower tiers, right, of technical training, while Brahmins, especially Brahmins, but also other upper castes, ended up monopolizing professional engineering, right? So we see that the stratification of technical training in the colonial period was also a caste stratification, right? There was this correlation between who you were in terms of caste and which tier of technical training you were tracked into. So to sum up, the development of engineering as a modern profession did not erode pre-existing forms of caste identity. In fact, what it did was it became a new basis, right? Engineering became a new basis for reproducing caste privilege. So as upper caste entered the modern occupations like engineering, they still remained very preoccupied with caste status and caste distinction, right? In other words, the modern engineer was also an upper caste person who was seen as upper caste and who saw himself as upper caste, right? There was a very clear correlation between being an engineer and being upper caste. Okay, so now let's shift to the post-independence period and look at how the constitutional language around reservations shaped understandings of merit, right? So we're going to shift now to looking at reservations policy in the post-independence period. So keep all of what I've said in mind as we move to this kind of a slightly different topic. So one of the key points to keep in mind about the transition to independence is the establishment of formal equality, right? So Indian citizens, no matter which caste or creed, were supposed to be treated as formally equal, right? And this was even though obviously forms of substantive inequality persisted, right? So you see this tension between formal equality, right? Forms of formal equality and substantive inequality. And of course, this tension between formal equality and substantive inequality has been a feature of most democracies, right? But when it comes to the treatment of caste, this tension becomes really consequential. So within the Constitutional Assembly debates leading up to independence, caste was widely regarded as a part of Indian social life that would and should be abolished, right, with social progress. At the same time, there was a stated commitment to redress, right, for those groups who were historically disadvantaged by caste. And of course, Dr. Ambedkar was one of the sort of key proponents of redress, right? He was one of the people who argued most strongly that the state needed to play a very active role in correcting for these historical inequalities, right, through certain forms of intervention. Okay, but these dual imperatives of caste abolition and redress, right, of transcending caste and intervening to correct for historical disadvantages, these dual imperatives found place within the Constitution, but they were given unequal weight. So the right to equality, to formal equality and non-discrimination are fundamental rights, whereas redress, right, the role of the state in providing correctives for caste disabilities is a directive principle. So fundamental rights, directive principle. And what is most significant for our purposes is how the language of redress, the language of correcting for historical inequalities, how this language actually ends up reinforcing the idea of upper caste as casteless and as meritorious. So how does this happen? So within the Constitution, the historically privileged castes, right, groups who were historically advantaged by caste, appear simply as individual citizens, right? And this is especially the case within reservations policy, where only the historically disadvantaged appear as castes. So those who qualify, and we see this, up to today, those who qualify for educational quotas on the basis of social disadvantages are identified within the reserved category on the basis of their caste affiliation, whereas those who do not qualify are simply classed under the general category, right, of merit-based admissions. So in effect, those in the general category are seen to embody the constitutional ideal of casteless citizenship, whereas the reserved category is seen as a negative departure from that ideal, right? The reservations are seen as a kind of interim measure on the road to true equality, right? But in the process, those who qualify are seen in some ways as lesser citizens, right? So what this does is it's a kind of perverse twist where the actual relationship between advantage and disadvantage is erased, and the reserved come to appear as the ones who are benefiting from these unfair advantages, right, that undercut true equality. So, and to put it another way, caste history or caste identity is only apparent when it comes to the reserved category, and it becomes invisible. It becomes erased when it comes to the general category. And this equation between the general, the casteless, and the meritorious, right, this idea that all of these things are equated, it reinforces the idea that those who fall within the general category do so not on the basis of their accumulated caste advantages, but simply by virtue of their merit. And as we all know, this distinction between the meritorious or the casteless on one side and the reserved or caste-based on the other has profoundly shaped the debate around educational equality in India up to today. It has allowed those who fall within the general category to argue that it is the reservation system, right? It's the reservation system and not enduring caste inequality. It's the reservation system that actually produces inequality and undermines the modern democratic ideal of equal citizenship, right? It allows those within the general category to make this argument, right? That they are casteless and more deserving, whereas the reserved are the ones who are perpetuating caste differences, right? And in doing so, they're the ones who are undermining true democracy, true equality. Okay, let's move to part 3. So what I've already laid out are the way the pre-independence history of engineering produced this monopoly, right? This upper caste monopoly of the engineering profession. So we've already looked at that. We've also looked at how within the constitutional language of reservations and the way reservations policy has been implemented, we see that this equation between the general category, castelessness, and merit, that this has kind of allowed upper castes to argue that they are casteless, right? And that they're more deserving, and that they're more representative of true democracy than lower caste. Okay, so we've seen both of these things. Now let's look at how this language of merit gets taken up within the IITs, right? Okay, it's useful to think about claims to merit at the IITs in terms of 3 things, right? Institutional stratification, examination outcomes, and evaluations of character. So let's start with institutional stratification. So what are the IITs? The IITs, from their founding, right, in the 1950s, they were, as central government institutions, they were deemed institutions of national excellence. They were given far greater autonomy in how they functioned. They were provided with much greater resources, right, than regional engineering colleges. And this autonomy, right, also made them far less susceptible to political pressure to democratize access to education, right? And as a result, all the way through to the 2000s, the IIT faculty and student body remained far more upper caste, right, than even the next tier of engineering colleges. But at the same time, even though they remained overwhelmingly upper caste in composition, at the same time, because of their status as institutions of national excellence, the IITs are widely regarded as institutions defined by merit and not by caste privilege, right? And this is all the more so because within the IITs, only those who are eligible for quotas are seen as members of castes, right? In other words, within the IITs, this constitutional distinction between the reserved and the general is used to say that only quota students, right, belong to caste, right? They are the only ones who are marked by caste. So in other words, institutional stratification and the association of the general category with castelessness has allowed the IITs to appear as uniquely meritorious institutions where caste has no place, right? And I wanted to point to Tamil Nadu, where I did most of my research. This is especially the case in regions like Tamil Nadu, which have a long history of caste tensions and an expanding reservation system. So in Tamil Nadu, IIT Madras has been used, especially by Tamil Brahmins, to bypass reservation and to lay claim to a central government institution where, as they see it, merit and not caste is the only basis for admission, right? So, but even as they say this, at the same time, Tamil Brahmins frame the choice of IIT Madras as a means to secure their right to education, which they feel has been taken away by regional politics, right? So there's this interesting way in which Tamil Nadu, Tamil Brahmins both see IIT as casteless and they see IIT as meritocratic because upper castes are more represented within this institution than in other regional engineering colleges. So there's a kind of way in which they both see IIT Madras as casteless and meritocratic because it is an upper caste institution, right? They go back and forth between these two kinds of claims. Okay, a second practice through which the IITians lay claim to merit is obviously through the examination rank, and this is something that all of us are very familiar with. And this also carries through from the pre-independence period. Remember, I already said that this distinction between engineering and artisanship and the trades was seen as a distinction between the conceptual and the manual, right? The labor of the mind and the labor of the hands. And now, one of the ways the IITs are seen as, one of the reasons why the IITs are seen as institutions of national excellence and distinct from other engineering colleges is because they're seen as more conceptually rigorous, right? The training you get at the IITs is seen as more conceptually oriented than the training you get at other engineering colleges. But this has less to do with it has in part to do with the training the students receive at the institutions, but it also has to do with the aura around the JEE exam, right? So as I said at the beginning, standardized exams, these mass examinations, are seen as objective measures of merit, right? And the outcomes of these exams are used to say that the rank, right? The rank stands in for individual merit, right? The rank appears to be an objective measure of individual intellectual worth, disconnected from social determinants, right? Disconnected from caste history. And because the exam is assumed to filter only the best and the brightest out of a vast pool of candidates, the JEE rank stands in for merit, right? And it continues to define the IITian throughout his or her life, right? It can often determine whether you get a job. It can determine how high you move up the ranks in your job, etc. The rank keeps being invoked, right, as the true measure of merit. And again, to go back to Tamil Nadu, what we see, though, is that the outcomes of the exam, who does well in these exams and who doesn't do well in these exams, has everything to do with the history of caste, okay? So what we see when we look at the exams, at the JEE's outcomes, is that, and I'm going to speak about Tamil Nadu here, but this is more generally applicable. Most Tamilians who get into the IITs tend to come from central board schools, okay? Schools run by the central board, such as the Kendriya Vidyalaya, the DAV school, Sri Shankara. These are the main schools that send students to the IITs within Tamil Nadu. Now, when we look at who attends these schools, these are the students who do especially well in the JEE. When we look at who attends these schools, we see the history of caste very clearly. So Central Board students are drawn overwhelmingly from families employed within central government services. And the vast majority are from upper caste backgrounds and predominantly from Brahmin backgrounds. So these are families with histories of education and state employment. And these are families in which children are cultivated. They're cultivated for higher education. They're cultivated for professional success. These are students whose parents and even grandparents have had experience with exams, right? Like the UPSC exam. And they have made a point of training their children in how to study and take exams, right? So these are people who are familiar with the exam as a technical instrument, and this predisposes them to success in examinations like the JEE. So in other words, the outcome of these exams have everything to do with caste histories of education and employment. They are not simply about individual merit, right? Disassociated from the history of caste. Even though they're seen right? Even though the JEE is seen as an objective arbiter of merit, that is just a test for innate talent and individual skill, it actually has much more to do, right, with family and caste history. Now, of course, there have been important shifts in patterns of IIT admission over the past decade plus because of two things, right? One is the rapid expansion of the coaching industry, which has now become a multi-billion-dollar industry. And of course, the second thing is the implementation of a new set of quotas for OBCs, right? And these changes, both the expansion of coaching and the expansion of quotas, both of these things have brought new groups into the IITs, right? Especially since the mid-2000s. And these are groups who don't come from the same social backgrounds as earlier cohorts, which were overwhelmingly upper caste. So to go back to IIT Madras, which I know best, the most significant change to the student body from the 2000s on, the most significant change has been the entry of students from Andhra Pradesh and from Telangana. And these are students who are some from lower caste backgrounds, but also from lower middle class and non-urban backgrounds. Some of them are upper caste, but they're not from the same urban cosmopolitan backgrounds as previous cohorts, right? So you have both many more lower caste students coming through, and many more non-urban, right, upper caste students whose families are not, from professional backgrounds, etc. So these are students who don't have the same cultural breeding, right? They don't have the same caste history, exactly the same caste history as these other upper castes who previously populated the IITs, right? And this is where this third way in which merit is claimed through evaluations of character, this is where this becomes particularly important. So this increasing caste and class diversity within the IITs, right, has produced a new set of arguments about merit that have to do with character. So upper caste students and faculty often express the sense that the original character of the institutions has been diluted, right? It's been diluted by the entry of people who are not as meritocratic, right? That these are people who don't know how to inhabit the institution properly. They bring in things like regional dialects. They don't know how to dress properly. There are all of these ways in which these new groups of students are seen as lesser, right? They're seen as not as a kind of departure from the proper IITian, right? They're seen as not embodying the traits of the proper IITian. And of course, even though these rural upper caste students are also denigrated, the most common accusation is about quota students, right? Who are seen as having taken seats away from those who are more deserving. They're seen as unable to cope, right, with the kind of the intellectual demands of institutions like the IITs, and they're constantly made to feel that they don't belong, right? That they don't have the intellectual heft, they don't have the character to be at an institution like the IIT. And of course, this produces forms of imposter syndrome. We've seen the effects on things like not just dropout rates, but also suicides, right? Especially of Dalit students at the IITs and other central government institutions. So these arguments about character and who belongs and who doesn't belong have far-reaching effects, right? They've been incredibly damaging to students who are consistently made to feel inferior, right, within these institutions. And of course, much of this kind of discussion about the changing character of the IITs happens at the level of everyday conversation, right? Passing remarks, right, about X or Y student not having the marks, or X or Y student having illegitimately availed of the quota to get in. But there have also been more systematic efforts to sustain the upper caste character of the IITs, not just through these kind of everyday interactions on campuses, but also through larger forms of anti-reservation politics. So let me come to the final part of the talk, which is about 3 examples of anti-reservation politics. And the reason I'm giving these 3 is because I want us to see how claims to merit have both persisted over time, but also have gone through certain changes. Okay, so I'm going to start with an example from 1973. And this is when the quotas for SC/STs were first introduced within the IITs, right? And this is an example, again, I'm going to go back to Tamil Nadu. And the reason, again, that I'm bringing up Tamil Nadu is because I want us to see that the opposition to reservations in Tamil Nadu began very early, right? And it anticipated the kinds of reactions that we then saw spreading across India, okay, with the implementation of the Mandal Commission recommendations in 1990 and 2000 and 2006. So in this sense, again, Tamil Nadu is a really important precedent for understanding anti-reservation politics and the politics of meritocracy across India, that has become a much more widespread phenomenon. Okay, so this first example, as I said, goes back to 1973. And this is when the 22.5% quota for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes were implemented at the IITs. And this, at the time, one of the most vocal opponents, right, of the quota was a man named P.V. Indiresan, who was the director of IIT Madras, and he served as director from 1979 to 1984. And in the director's report of 1983, he made this statement. He says, some members of the Parliamentary Committee on Scheduled Castes have gone so far as to say that what we need is an Indian standard and not an international standard of instruction. It's necessary to debate the fundamental question of whether, just because a group of people cannot cope with a certain level of education, they should have the veto power to deny such an education to the rest. Whether social justice should imply that there should be no institution at all in the country where merit shall be the criterion, and also while the socially deprived should have special privileges, the talented need have no rights of their own. So this is it's a pretty remarkable quote, right? So what is Indiresan doing in this quote? He's drawing a distinction between the socially deprived and the talented, right? And what is this distinction doing? It really underscores the idea that upper castes are the talented, and they're the talented not because they come from certain caste backgrounds, but simply because they have certain innate abilities, right? So we have the socially deprived, which obviously is a way of signaling caste, and the talented. Now, he doesn't call upper caste the socially advantaged, right? He simply calls them the talented. So this distinction shows that for him, caste only applies to the socially deprived. Caste does not apply to the talented. The talented are simply individuals, right? They're caste-free individuals. They're caste-less individuals. He also draws a distinction between special privileges and rights. And what is this doing? What is this distinction doing? What this does is it underscores the idea that reservations are anti-democratic, right? That reservations are a way of giving special privileges to the socially deprived, right? This is not correcting for the privileges that have been historically enjoyed by upper castes, this is giving special privileges to the socially deprived. And in doing so, you are depriving the talented of their rights. So again, here we see this idea that reservations are anti-democratic because they're about special privileges. They undercut the rights, the equal rights of the talented who are not caste subjects. They're simply individual citizens, right? Who have been denied their rights by this unfair system of reservations. And then the final thing that he does in this quote is he contrasts an Indian with an international standard. So what is he doing here? He's arguing that the IITs are more in line with a global norm, right? A global norm, an international standard where excellence is not sacrificed to social justice, right? And he's saying that India deserves a tier of institutions where only excellence prevails and is not sacrificed to these other considerations of social justice, right? So there's a lot going on in this quote. And we see in this quote these echoes of the language of constitutionalism, right? This idea of the talented as casteless, as meritorious, and the reserved as caste-based, right? As having special privileges, as undercutting democratic equality. Before I move on, I also want to say that, again, what's really important here is he's arguing for a certain intellectual standard, right, to be maintained, and that it can only be maintained by bracketing social justice as a consideration. It can only be maintained by distinguishing excellence from social justice and seeing these two things as incommensurable. So this is important because as we move forward and we look at anti-reservations language, we see these subtle shifts, okay? So the second example is from 1990. And of course, I'm not sure how young or old people in the audience are, but some of you will remember the protests in 1990 that were sparked by the Mandal Commission's recommendations, right, of 27% OBC reservation in public sector employment. And of course, at the time, upper caste students, especially in the north, but also in other parts, especially in the north, in the Hindi belt, they took to the streets, and they took to the streets to protest the end of merit as they saw it, right? And one of the really interesting things about these protests is that these students were both claiming that they were meritorious, that they had no understanding of caste, right? That they were caste free. But in their protests, part of what they did was they masqueraded, right, as lower caste laborers, right? They masqueraded as vendors, as sweepers, as a way of demonstrating what would happen to them if the Mandal Commission recommendations were actually implemented, right? So in effect, what they were doing they were performing their reduction to the status of low caste labor, to their reduction to manual labor, right? Which of course is an explicit statement about caste identity, right? And what they felt they were entitled to as upper caste. So here again, we see that they're both saying that they're casteless and caste free, and they're saying that they deserve certain, they have certain entitlements by virtue of being from certain caste backgrounds, right? And of course, the most charged act of protest and the one that got the most attention was self-immolation. And this idea that, is there a problem? I'm seeing some. Is it frozen?
Yeah, I think their screen is frozen.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I think their screen was frozen. Yeah.
Okay, did you hear what I was saying? When did I cut out?
self-emulation.
Okay, good. All right. So yeah, so
Hello. Okay, so the YouTube link is continuing. So please mute, and Ajantha, Professor Ajantha, please continue.
okay, great. So one of the most charged acts of protest, there were these performances of reduction to lower caste labor, but one of the most charged acts of protest was self-immolation, right? And I mean, think about that for a minute. The idea that death was preferable to becoming like lower caste, right? That death was preferable to these efforts to correct for historical advantages and disadvantages. That's a remarkable statement about both caste entitlement and about caste stigma, right? And the final aspect of the 1990 protest that I wanted to point to is how they express an investment in public sector employment, right? And this is, of course, this has been continuous from the pre-independence period. I pointed out that one of the reasons why upper castes finally entered the engineering profession was because of its association with the state, right? Because it was seen as an avenue to state employment, to employment in public works, in the railways, etc., etc.
If I may interrupt.
Okay, so the YouTube link is continuing. So please mute, and Ajantha.
Can I continue? Is it okay? Should I continue?
Madam, I think you should start from
No, yeah, you please continue. The YouTube is fine; it's going fine.
Okay.
Naveen, please mute. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So as I was saying, this sort of investment in state employment and this association of state employment with a certain kind of status, this is also what is being expressed in these 1990 protests, right? There was this fierce opposition to reserving to reservations in public sector employment. Now, we've come quite a distance from the 1990s, right? It's now hard to imagine anti-reservations protests being waged to preserve upper caste access to state employment, because the value and status of state employment, the value and status of public sector employment has diminished greatly, right, from the 1990s, and really ever since the start of economic liberalization, right? And so this gives you a sense of how the objective, right, the objective and the kinds of entitlements that are being expressed through anti-reservations politics have changed over time. And we see this in the final example from the 2000s. And again, when Mandal 2 was implemented, right, which was the 27% reservation in central government higher educational institutions like the IITs, many of you will have first-hand knowledge and memory of how this played out. And what I want to emphasize here is that the protests were no longer about protecting public sector jobs, right, from lower caste entry. Now it was much more about protecting the brand of institutions like the IITs. And why is that? Why? Because the brand is seen as really important for entry into the private sector, right? So the protests were much more about brand dilution and what the entry of OBCs would mean for the market value of these pedigrees. And significantly, these protests were waged both in India and in the United States, where, as you know, there's a huge there's a huge IIT alumni population, right? And so we saw these kind of parallel protests. So students in India were organizing against Mandal 2 under the banner of Youth for Equality, whereas alumni in the United States were organizing under the banner of Indians for Equality. And one of the protests was held in Silicon Valley, right, which was very close to the head offices of Google and Yahoo and Cisco. And there was an interesting interview that an Indian reporter did with an IIT alumnus working as a Silicon Valley engineer, and this is what the I'm not able to. Anyway, let me just go ahead and I'll read it to you. This is what he said. He said, "Let Arjun Singh do whatever he wants." Who was the Home Minister at the time? "Let Arjun Singh do whatever he wants to any educational institute in India, but tell him to leave the IITs alone. It's because of us that the West has recognized the worth of India. Remember, brand India is brand IIT." So there's two things that are important to note here. First is that after liberalization, there's been a significant shift from the early post-independence efforts to secure public sector employment, right, against reservations. Now, as you see with the term brand IIT, the IIT pedigree is a hot commodity in the private marketplace, with IITians entering the private sector far more than the public sector and entering the private sector with far higher starting salaries. But we're also seeing something else in this statement. We're seeing that for IITians, brand IIT is not just about merit, it's also about caste, right? So the idea that the entry of lower castes threatens the institutional brand, right, suggests that for upper caste IITians, the market value of brand IIT depends on its continued association with upper castes, right? They see the equation between brand IIT and upper casteness. That equation is under threat. That equation is under threat by Mandal 2, right? And so through these three examples, right, one from the 1970s, one from the 1990s, one from the 2000s, we see how merit over the post-independence period has remained a key idea, right? It remained a key argument made by upper castes to protect their own monopoly, right? A monopoly of engineering education and the engineering profession. And in this sense, the arguments about merit are also arguments about caste privilege, right? But we're also seeing that what is being fought for in the name of merit, what is being protected in the name of merit has changed over time. It's changed from a notion of educational excellence in 1973 to public sector employment in 1990, and finally to brand value, which is incredibly important in the private marketplace in 2006. And these changes, what they do is they reflect transformations in India's political economy, right? But they also reflect the ongoing struggles by social movements to advance lower caste rights in various spheres. Okay, so I'm just going to conclude now with a brief comment. So as I see it, everything that I've talked about, right? The pre-independence beginnings of engineering education, the monopoly of higher castes, upper castes over engineering, how reservations policy has reinforced this idea of upper caste as uniquely meritorious and helped to mask the operations of caste privilege. And then, the claims to merit and how these claims to merit within the IITs have further reinforced this idea. I think what all of this suggests is that the current standoff in India is between two competing visions of democratic equality. The first vision rests on a formal definition of equality that attributes social hierarchies to the natural and innate aptitudes of individuals and groups, right? Except that, of course, these individuals and groups happen to be from certain social backgrounds, but that's kind of bracketed, right? So this first definition of democratic equality is about a formal equality, right? where, yes, there is social hierarchy, but the social hierarchy is based on natural talents, right? It's not based on the operations of power and inequality. But there's a second vision of democratic equality, and this is one which presupposes the existence of historically accumulated advantages and disadvantages, and the need for measures to level opportunity so that equality is substantive and not just formal. And so those who most vocally oppose reservations, they're making the first kind of argument for formal equality, right? And they're arguing that substantive equality, that these efforts to advance substantive equality actually undercut democracy. They undercut, right, democracy. So as I see it, the strident upper caste claim to merit and the discrediting of reservations is evidence. It's actually evidence of increasingly incommensurable visions of the Indian future, which does not bode well, right? For the future of democracy in India. And I haven't said anything about the post-Modi period. I wish I had time to go into that because we've seen another set of changes that have happened from 2014 on, with the central government intervening much more forcefully, right, on central government campuses to try to reinstate the upper caste culture of these campuses, right? We're seeing a kind of active alignment of the Modi government with one set of students against the other, with disastrous outcomes like the death of Rohit Vemula, right? The institutional murder, as some would call it, of Rohit Vemula. I haven't had the time to go into that, but this is this recent period is much more familiar to all of you. So I hope that what I have said in the talk helps you think about the current moment, the contemporary moment, in useful ways. So thanks a lot. I know I've taken up the whole time. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, it's just an enlightening conversation, and like we have like understood the history of like engineering education in India, and how like it has always been associated with caste, and how like even throughout the time from post-colonial, like from the colonial times to the post-colonial era after independence and after the Mandal Commission implementation, how the nature of these institutions, especially IITs and other centrally controlled higher education institutions, have like how it has changed, and how like the upper castes are using merit as an argument to kind of not allow the people from the oppressed classes to actually enter this institution. So how they are gatekeeping it in some sense. So I think like we can, if you have time, we can go for the question answering session, like, or
I don't have a huge amount of time because I have another meeting.
Okay.
Are there lots of questions that have been posted?
Let me check. I think maybe one or two questions. Okay. Okay, so the question is that the entry of upper caste non-urban students who didn't who didn't have the same like caste histories as their urban upper caste counterparts into IIT, does that impact our discussion about merit and how it is associated with caste? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit? And would you say that the concept of merit in the Indian education system is a myth?
Yeah, so I mean, I can talk about the first part of the question just with reference to IIT Madras, which is the context I know best. So what's really interesting about the entry of these sort of upper castes from rural backgrounds, right, in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, is that what it did was it sort of forced it forced upper castes from urban backgrounds, right, who were the more traditional IIT student, who represented the more traditional IIT student. It forced them to redefine merit not just as a caste trait, but also as a class trait, right? So these rural upper castes were also seen as non-ideal IITians, right? Just as lower caste students are seen as non-ideal in one sense, rural upper castes are also seen as non-ideal in another sense, right? So there's a way in which their entry forced a kind of redefinition of caste as both, a redefinition of merit as both, in both caste and class terms, right? And in fact, there was a sort of embarrassment around the presence of these students because they were seen as non-ideal upper caste, right? That they didn't embody upper casteness in the way that they were supposed to, right? So upper castes are supposed to speak perfect English. They're supposed to not bring their kind of regional identities and languages into the institution. But that's exactly what these students from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana did, right? They spoke in Telugu, etc. And this was all seen as almost as kind of destabilizing, right? It kind of blurred that boundary between upper and lower in a way that I think was very, in a way that in some ways kind of undercut, right, this equation between caste and merit. So I'll just say that about the entry of these rural students. Is merit a fiction? Was that the question? Is merit a fiction?
Is it a myth? Like,
is it a myth?
Meritocracy a myth?
I mean, myth is an odd word. I would say that merit is an ideology, right? It's an ideology that works to naturalize certain forms of social hierarchy, right? It's an ideology that masks the operation of caste hierarchy, right? So it's less a myth than it is a mechanism, right, for the reproduction of caste hierarchy, right? I mean, to the extent that it is a myth, I think it's certainly meritocracy is not something which is an avenue to greater equality, right? I mean, I think it's really important to call into question, right, the equation between meritocracy and democracy, right? I think that equation is itself an ideological weapon, right? And I think we really have to question that because for the most part, and this is not just in India, this is also in the United States, for the most part, when people claim merit, right, they're doing so to push against efforts at greater democratization. That's what they're doing, right? Yeah.
So maybe one last question.
Sure.
So since you brought up the affirmative action policies in US and how merit is used as a argument against it. So in India, we have seen that the upper caste who are completely against reservation, they kind of try to use the affirmative action policies in US education institutions and get in through the diversity quota, because all the top institutions in the world are now trying to increase the diversity within their campuses because they understood that is better for the overall educational quality in some sense. So how do you see that?
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting. So I asked this question of alumni in the US, right? IIT alumni. And you're right that most of them are in favor of diversity. And they're strongly opposed to reservations, right? So how do they kind of reconcile these two things? And what's interesting is that they see diversity as consistent with meritocracy, whereas they see reservations as antithetical to meritocracy. So how is that? I think one of the really important things to keep in mind is what has happened to affirmative action in the United States, right? So when affirmative action was first instituted, right, in the 1960s, it operated very similarly to reservations in India. There were quotas, and the idea was precisely to correct for collective disadvantages, right? But there have been attacks, systematic attacks on affirmative action from the 1970s on in the US. And the response to these attacks is to now speak only in the language of diversity, right? So you can know, so quotas were dismantled. Quotas are now illegal in the US. So the only way you can diversify institutions, the only way you can correct for the historical monopoly of whites is to handpick uniquely meritocratic individuals to diversify institutions, right? That is the only mechanism through which diversity operates now. And because it's about individual meritocratic students who are from underrepresented social groups, this policy is seen by Indians in the US as consistent with meritocracy, right? Because it's about individuals, it's about individuals who have to be who are proven to be equally meritorious to others, and it's a kind of tokenistic measure, right? I mean, you're never going to really change the social composition of higher educational institutions through this mechanism of handpicking individuals from underrepresented groups, right? You're never going to get a kind of substantial transformation of the demographics of these institutions, right? So for all of these reasons, so there's obviously there's a cynical reason as well, which is that when it comes to diversity, Indians qualify, right? Because they're racial minorities. So there's a cynical reason why they support diversity, but they don't support reservations. But there's also this other reason, which is that affirmative action actually works very differently in the US than reservations do here, right? It's not a collective measure, right? It's a highly individuated measure, and it's very circumscribed, right? It's highly limited. And that's because there's been so much pushback from the 70s on, right? I mean, the first legal challenge to affirmative action in the US was in the 1970s. And since then, the grounds for affirmative action have systematically been eroded, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Ajantha, for your time and for this really amazing talk, and for like accepting our invite to be the first speaker on the first talk that we are organizing as the SCST Students Cell.
It's a pleasure, and please let me know about your talks and programming going forward. You know, I can circulate the information to my network, so you have a good audience, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. So yeah, so we have finally come to the end of this amazing talk, and I hope like everyone have got an understanding on how merit has been used as an argument, especially in the Indian higher education sector, to kind of like gatekeep it as a space for upper caste, and how to exclude the people from oppressed caste to get inside these institutions, and like pave way for a much more democratization of the higher education sector in India. I would also like to thank Tarun and others, sir, from CDeep, who have helped us in setting up this event and live stream it in YouTube. So yeah, so that's all for today, and happy Ambedkar Jayanti for tomorrow. Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim. Thank you.